Change and innovation in schools doesn't have to be a source of whiplash for teachers or school administrators. Rather, it can be the spark that keeps our classrooms alive and always evolving. When we're able to bridge the gap between a bold administrative vision and the daily magic that happens in the classrooms, we create a culture that can truly thrive. And today, we're going to explore how to turn the challenge of any transition at a school into a shared journey toward a brighter future for every student. This is I Demand a Meeting, a podcast where two educators in private schools talk honestly about leadership, teaching, and the things we don't usually say in staff meetings. I'm Jesse, that's Jared, and today we're going to continue our conversation about academics. We've talked a lot in the last few episodes about rethinking academics. Now we're going to dig into why change can be so challenging for school staff. So how are you today, Jared?
I'm well, Jesse. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. So why is it that, in an industry like ours, where we are, you and I are former teachers, but we're teachers, right? And we're working with teachers. Why can it be so hard as we're talking about these changes in academics? Why can it be so hard for schools to embrace change?
Probably the number one thing I have observed is there's no reason to change that most adults would probably add to this list of why are we changing something. The base case for what we're currently doing isn't already sufficient. And then yet alone my own personal connection to what we're currently doing. Sometimes I feel there's a personal attack on if you're asking me personally to now change and do something different. I think the first thing, Jesse, is building the need for change. There's not really a common vision that's shared because the promised land that it will be so much better if we just do X, Y, or Z, that's a risky proposition. So probably the first thing that comes to my mind is that I don't think people are very convinced that we should be changing. And if they are convinced, maybe they're at least skeptical of it because they don't know what fruit may come out on the other side. What say you?
Yeah, no, a lot of that is vision casting, right? Where you're painting the picture of the preferred future. A lot of times in change like this, what comes to mind while you were talking was the idea of ethos, pathos, and logos, of appealing to the different parts of the heart and the mind and the will and emotions and all of that to sell it really well and establishing our relational credibility, trustworthiness, those kind of things. Yeah, great thoughts.
Would you agree that whether they're small, medium, or large changes, that in that vision casting, that preferred future, the most successful change usually comes when not all, but most of the people that are impacted by it realize there's an issue and they realize that what we're currently doing probably isn't meeting the needs of whatever that issue is. But I think the hardest change, some people might say it's when it's a top down initiative. We like to use that phrase in education. Those types of change are like pulling teeth if the entire group, or at least most of the group, doesn't feel like, yeah, we probably need to change this.
Yeah. And there's a lot of factors that go into that, school history, teacher history, and longevity, workload, those kind of things. But yeah, you're never going to get consensus in a school, but you can get buy-in. You can have advocates and cheerleaders. You can have I always like to use the language of pilot groups who might try something and then be able to testify on its effectiveness. And those things can help to create that understanding that there's a need for change. And then sometimes there's, whether it's a mandate from a school district or a head of school in our case or something, where you just got to rip a Band-Aid off and say, this is what we're doing. And we know it's uncomfortable. But in general, getting folks, just like for you and I, for any change we need to make in our lives, to that point where we say, yeah, I got to do something. This isn't working. I got to do something different.
Jesse, tell me, in your experience too, let's talk about the habit side. You know as well as I do, we don't like to change our routines. Probably what you do in the morning and I do in the morning to get ready for work every day, or maybe a little bit of difference in the weekend, is probably the same routine. And as older we get, we like our routines. It gives us stability. We don't have to think very much. We kind of go on autopilot. But why is that obviously a little bit of a problem when we're talking about educating kids?
Yeah, for sure. So, not just you and me, but for all of us school leaders listening, teachers don't like change all that much. There's not a lot of crazies like me that like to pursue professional developments, constantly seeking to grow 1% at a time and see that compounding and how to get better. Teachers like to plan, teach, and grade. Don't make me change my room. Don't make me change my
Yeah.
lesson plan template. Those kind of things. And I'm sympathetic. I get it. There's a few reasons I think that people and I'm pulling from a source I found great value in that make people resist change. First is biologically and physiologically, our bodies seek equilibrium and homeostasis. We like to just keep things the way they are. Stability and consistency, like you just referenced, it feels safe, it feels predictable, whereas change can create a feeling of strain. And none of us like that. And so then we become resistant to that potential strain in order to protect ourselves. And then we also know there's only so much bandwidth we can take. And so changing costs cognitive energy and neural effort. And so it's easier to default to our autopilot and to our habits than to embrace trying to learn a new behavior. And it seems like the older I get, I don't know about you, but the less inclined I am to want to embrace that. We don't have the level of neuroplasticity that the teenagers I work with have, and they can just pick stuff up so quickly and easily. And then one other is this idea of a status quo bias, where we are inclined to actually prefer the existing conditions over the uncertain future if the discomforts feel safer, like even while the discomforts feel safer than that uncertainty. Like we'll take the discomfort that we know rather than the uncertainty that we don't know.
Ain't that the truth, man? And you're right about the uncertainty piece because that's what makes us nervous. We get our comfort, but from knowing what we're actually doing every day, and anything in the direction of going away from that, my uncertainty and anxiety rises. And now being a subject matter expert or a kindergarten level expert starts to crumble if I've built my whole personality and my leadership on the fact that I know what I'm doing.
Yeah. So a couple of key refrains that I think are really important to address. I think the biggest root of the issue is most often fear of the unknown. We just addressed that a little bit more, but there's a couple of other things, Jared, that I think it's worth acknowledging. And as school leaders, we really need to be mindful of and sympathetic to these and consider them in our approach to managing or leading through change. Change is just having to change is hard, but one thing we got to be mindful of or cast a vision for is that people perceive when there's going to be a change that they're going to just have to work more, that there's some sort of trade off, that they're giving up working less because a system is already in place that works for them, or they already know this curriculum and don't want to do this curriculum because it's new. The idea of having to work more is a tough one. So, showing or walking through how to manage that. But here's the bigger one that I interact with more frequently on my campus. And I would argue that you probably do as well, and most school leaders do. Teachers oftentimes were great students and tend to be perfectionists, want to achieve highly and do really, really well. And so they do that. And I've got incredible teachers who are locked in on what they're doing and doing really well, the best they know with what we have. And so if I'm asking them to do something different or to change, especially like a large scale or wholesale change, that can take them and put them in a vulnerable position to where they may not come off as perfect as they have been for the number of years that they've been doing what they're doing. And so they've got to buy into putting themselves out there and potentially looking like a novice again or making mistakes or having to grow and just not looking all the time like everything they're doing is totally buttoned up. And that's a big risk that we're asking them to take. I found that I just am comfortable and get familiar with taking that risk, but I don't know. What do you think about that idea?
And Jesse, I think part of that, the vulnerability piece is in the comfort zone is actually connected to something that we all experience, whether that's for kids or adults. And that's, I feel like I can operate best when I know, again, what I'm doing. And so please don't ask me to get out of my comfort zone and start learning all this new stuff. I know when you get to work with teachers directly, do you experience some of this yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I talk about embrace the discomfort zone. We ask students to do that every day. Yeah. I'm really glad you mentioned that. So we encourage our students to get out of their comfort zone, to learn new things, to grow every day. And teachers really need to be leading it. We all do need to be leading and modeling that. I get the cliches, and I know that they're cliches, but they're real. They're true. I embrace them. I love them. That we should be the lead learners. We should be the lifelong learners. We should be modeling growth for our students. So I say embrace or get comfortable with the discomfort zone, not the comfort zone. I use a mantra here with our team: always striving, never arriving. Meaning, as soon
Mm.
as we think that we've got it all figured out, that's kind of the end of our growth right there. And so, always striving, never arriving. I feel like that this profession is not the type that is a set it and forget it kind of thing, where you just build the system once and then you just run it innumerable times. I think it's got to be one that's evolving and adapting and responding to the things that are coming at us, that are always changing around us, while not compromising on the mission, vision, and core values. Staying true to who you are as a school, and your identity as a school, but being nimble on the best practices to make sure you're meeting the needs of your stakeholders and the learners in your building.
To add to what you're communicating, I've observed that the speed by which change is occurring also has a huge ripple effect on that comfort zone, or like what you said, the discomfort zone, getting out of that. I think the speed at how we change, and this starts with us as leaders, is really paramount to the, let's say, the higher probability that the change that we are implementing actually will be successful. I've had everything from great experience with this and maybe that are not so great. And when it's been not so great, is probably because either me or others around me were saying, we're going to go do this and it's going to happen yesterday. And so we talked in prior episode about bulldozer parents. It's kind of like a bulldozer leader when it comes to change, because it's easy to then communicate to the other constituency, hey, parents, look at these great changes we're making around here. Or maybe it's to students. Yeah, we're going to get that change. No problem. But we realize that long-term impact, long-term change takes a methodical approach to how we go about doing that. And so I think the speed, maybe a recommendation, if you will, for how we approach change, if we build a base case that there is an issue and not everyone, but most of our faculty and parents, and maybe even some students in some cases know we need to change, gosh, does that make it easier? But then I think our job is to lay out a sequence of change over a period of time. And if it's some instructional practice that we've been preaching and talking about over the last several episodes, I might even try to, I'd love your feedback on this, maybe start with a couple of people, pilot group kind of thing, let them kick the tires on the idea, let them learn. And then not only let them learn, let them kind of help co teach others about we've been to the promised land, if you will, and we checked it out. Now we're coming back to report. So, what is your experience with kind of starting small too with change? Have you found that to be more effective?
We are right in the middle of it right now. In the biggest sense, I'm in year 5 with my staff, and I haven't had too much staff turnover. And so I've got a strong core of people with whom I've been building rapport and establishing trust. And there have been some changes that I've been desiring to make for a number of years, as I felt they would be the most impactful on some of the challenges or limitations that our team has. But I have not had the buy-in advocacy cheerleaders or rapport yet to be able to pull it off. But this year coming up, we're making a big change for next year. We're planning it right now, but it's part of a progression. So one has been building rapport, building trust, being consistent, getting buy-in, and then starting a progression. We're using kind of a 3-year progression. Year 1, we looked
Nice.
really, really closely at what our challenges and our limitations were and became really able to articulate them very clearly. Year 2 was working together in a pilot group with a small group of teachers who we proactively approached to try out doing some things differently, compensated them for it, gave them some extra time, a few extra requirements. They've got to try the things, they got to journal, they got to communicate, they got to collect data to make sure it works. And then they're leading our PDs pretty much all this spring. And then year 3 next year is when we're going to try some larger scale implementation. Now, I could have just tried to roll these things out right away a couple of years back when I identified that they could be good solutions, but we just weren't there yet. And so I do have one horror story on that. I came from a school with you where we did things very differently academically. And then I came to a very traditional school that was not familiar in the least with what we had been doing. And I popped in and said, "Hey guys, we're going to do this major big change differently." And I just assumed that they were going to say, "Of course, that sounds great. Let's do that." Like, yeah, that's a no-brainer. And that was not the case. What I was describing was like speaking Chinese and was not something that was familiar to them and kind of was not ingrained into who our school is in light of the culture around us. And so I had to I had to hit pause on that big time, regroup, do a lot more research and plan and factor how we were going to get there. So I feel like we're doing it better this time because I did it really poorly the first time.
I think what you're getting at, Jesse, and I think the phrase is know your people, know your culture. There are just some things, and sometimes we learn it the hard way, sometimes we learn it somewhat easier way. There's no other way around it than whether it's certain parts of the country, whether that's got influence by local constituencies in terms of how they see education. You and I both know the problem with education that everyone has received in education, and we'll always have a little bit of a stigma or bias, if you will, towards how education should go. And so if we ever deviate from that of what the customer sees education should be, and then if we scale it up to say what staff think education should and should not be, it gets very, very difficult to try to implement change. So knowing our cultures for leaders here of the final thought for the day, and we'll give our hot takes. But as a recommendation, I love what Jesse just said. First year, scoping the scene, laying out some plans, just you're learning as much as you can. And once we learn better, we may have an idea for something, but maybe it gets executed a little bit differently in another school environment versus, say, the prior one, to your example. I cannot underestimate the amount of energy that we can save and time and headache by knowing our people and knowing the culture. If I know good teaching practices are universally good teaching practices, that's not what Jess and I are talking about. We're really talking about things that you want to emphasize, or maybe you want to become a project based school or a STEM school, or you want to get really creative, as we talked in some prior episodes about skill development as relates to mastery or competency or proficiency based approaches and different types of way we can give feedback to students. Whatever your flavor is, I think it starts humbly with saying, what does my constituency here believe and think about this topic? Because if I'm over here on planet Mars, I'm getting nowhere with my people.
Yep. Yep. And I made that mistake. I walked that road. I implemented some things to do differently, and it's going more smoothly this time. It's never smooth. You know, these things, everything we've talked about thus far in this episode about the reasons to not change or the reservations about it, those are real. And it's never just like, we're going to do this thing and everybody goes, "That sounds awesome. Let's do that." So it is real. But, you know, we'll kind of consider this. You don't want to turn it negative, but consider this. Like, imagine if other professions never or rarely evaluated and updated their practices to current and modern best practices, and they established a set it and forget it kind of repertoire in the way they do
Mm.
things. Whether it's your mechanic or your doctor or your financial planner, it wouldn't bode well. And I think it should be the same for us.
Jesse, give me your hot take for implementing change in our schools.
Yeah, I know it's cliche and it's hard to hear, but if you're a teacher listening to this, just be okay with being vulnerable. Be okay with not being perfect. Be okay with embracing the discomfort zone. That then creates the environment where we make it okay for our students to do that as well. When we're modeling how to walk through that with them, because that's what we ask them to do each and every day, we could do it ourselves. Jared, how about you? What's your key hot takeaway from this episode?
For leaders listening to this episode, again, set the vision for the change. If anything that I've learned is that when I have not taken enough time to really build the case for the change, I realize that some of you listening may have quote unquote mandates that you have to change, regardless of the opinions of those that you're leading. That's a really difficult situation. And there's outcomes that come of that that are not always the most enjoyable. But let's assume that you're in a fairly neutral or slightly positive environment, but you see some things that need to be updated or you could progress the organization on. Build the case for the change. Take the time to not just look at surveys and data and information, talk with teachers, talk with administrators, talk with others, and try to bring the message of, do you see this same issue that I am seeing or that so and so is seeing? Is this what we're all seeing? And sometimes it's that self-fulfilling prophecy and people start to believe that. Like, oh yeah, that is an issue. So much easier. Then we start getting into the how to and the monitoring and the execution if we build that case.
I like it. I like it. Great stuff. Well, friends, we've explored why staying still feels safe. But the heart of our profession lies in the same courage that we demand from our students every single day they're in our buildings. Just like we wouldn't trust our doctor or our mechanic to use a decades old playbook, we owe it to ourselves and especially to our students to stay in the discomfort zone of being open to growth. Embracing that vulnerability, the shift from being the expert to being the lead learner, is exactly how we turn a set it and forget it job into a lifelong calling that's purposeful and meaningful and impactful. And we can model how to do that for our students. So let us keep striving, because in education, the moment we stop thinking that we've arrived is the moment we start truly leading. Thank you, listeners, for hanging out with us here on the I Demand a Meeting podcast. We'd love to hear from you. We value your feedback. Leave us a comment, engage with us. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode of I Demand a Meeting.